Greetings and welcome back. We are in a second lecture that is an introductory lecture to an introduction to the Bible, a series of lectures that I'll be giving to my students to help them read the Bible in a non-apologetic approach, as we mentioned in our last conversation. By that we simply mean that we want to look at the biblical text as we would a literary text, for example, the study of the Iliad or the Odyssey, in which we're going to ask certain kinds of questions. Now, in this lecture, what I want to do is I want to talk about what I call the dance of the Bible. I want to demonstrate a way in which you can look at the story of the Bible from a non-apologetic perspective that is, I think, revelatory. And it certainly has helped me and the students that I've worked with in the past think about the events of the Bible in some way as being an epic or a dance of a certain kind. I'm going to talk about the Bible as a story, a dance between what I'm going to say a God and a God's people. I like to think about this in relationship to dancing. For example, you can take a look at a passage in 1 Chronicles 13:8. The moving of the Ark of the Covenant, we'll have much to say about this Ark of the Covenant later, is happening, and the people are dancing as they are moving this Ark of the Covenant. All of Israel dancing before God is the passage. I like to think of it as well, it's about music in some way. Sometimes happy music, sometimes not so happy music. Deuteronomy 31:19 through 22 is a classic example. The suggestion is that the song that is going to be taught by Moses to the people will be a witness of a certain kind. And so when you put these two together, the dance and the song, the music of the epic, and this is a way that I like to teach at least the fundamental background story. Remember, I'm trying to help you have some sense of background of how you pick up a text like the Bible, and you try to read it. Again, it's very difficult text to read if you just pick it up from the very beginning and read it to the very end without some sense of background information. I have a map here that will maybe help me to explain what I'm talking about. This dance movement, first of all, is a movement that will begin from a certain point, a certain place. We're going to talk about this area of Babylon. Present-day Baghdad is the easiest way to think about it. And we're going to begin with a really key figure, Abraham. We'll come back to talk about him quite a bit. And the significance of Abraham in our story cannot be overstated. Abraham will be called out of this area that we will today call Babylon. Today we'll of course reference it by virtue of Baghdad in Iraq. But Babylon will be our beginning point. And then we're going to have a movement that will move something like this into an area that we call today present-day Israel, was often referred to as the land of Canaan, the promised land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And there will be a movement then that will be back and forth, like a dance, if you've watched good dancers move back and forth, almost like a waltz. From this here area, we're going to find ourselves down into the area that we know of as Egypt, then out into a wilderness track for a certain period of time, then back into the promised land again. Ultimately, for reasons that we'll articulate here in a few moments, ultimately there will in fact be a return back to this area in what we will refer to as exile. And this will be a hypercritical moment around roughly 587, 586 BCE, before the Common Era. We'll then have a movement back to this very area before finally another return back again. So this, you can kind of get a sense of this movement. North to south, south to north, east to west, west back to east, and so on. Really, in many ways, you can think about this epic drama unfolding as being something about fathers and sons as well. We're going to have Abraham, who will find his way here into this land of Canaan. He's called by God, the story will tell us, and he will find himself there. Abraham will have two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Isaac will have two sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob, who will later be called Israel. All of these stories we're obviously going to cover as we meet the book of Genesis in later lectures. We'll have 12 sons. Ultimately, because of Joseph, one of those sons, he will end up along with the family down in Egypt. And there, of course, are the stories of the book of Genesis. Ultimately, you're going to have an exodus that will take these people out of, after reportedly 400 years of slavery, indentured service. They'll be taken out, they'll be led out, and the next major player name will be Moses for us. And you'll have this wandering in the wilderness, this area out here in the middle of present-day Arabia, out into this desert area, and these people are going to be traveling there. This will set the next stage for the story when the quote-unquote children of Israel, or these 12 tribes of Israel, finally will return back into the promised land, and land, as we've said before, flowing with milk and honey. The entry into the land is kind of like then coming back to Abraham's entry into the same land, followed by a time of judges and then kings. That national identity is forming. The question is how we will organize ourselves and who will lead us. The question, of course, about a king is then, is this in fact a betrayal of Israel's God? In other words, in this dance, this relationship between a God and a God's people, is this a good idea to have kings, or is it rather God's idea? We'll look at the text to try and get some sense of which of those is actually the case. Finally, we will have our period of the kings. Roughly, if you're looking for dates, we're going to qualify it as roughly 1000 BCE, okay? And this will be the high water mark in many ways. Now, these dates that I'm providing to you are obviously the subject of huge debate. Roughly, we're talking about the time of the Trojan Wars. It's told of in the Iliad, again, 1000 BCE. Again, these dates are debatable. You could make the argument that at least in the story of the Bible itself, it never gets any better than roughly the high water mark when you have the great kings of Saul, David, and his son Solomon. It's during the reign of Solomon, roughly 950. Most scholars believe that the story actually that we'll be outlining starts to be written down. And we have stories of Adam and Eve in the garden, and the Garden of Eden, Noah and the flood, these early stories of Genesis. Most scholars believe this is about the time they start to be written down and redacted. None of these stories in the early part of Genesis, as we'll meet them, claim to be eyewitness accounts or reports. In the early chapters of Genesis were written down and collected. Our word will be redacted later. Moses is often referred to as the writer of these early stories, but there's huge debate about whether Moses is actually the author or not. For example, if you want to take a look at a book called Numbers chapter 12 verse 3, it's pretty clear that Moses probably didn't write that verse which claims that Moses was the most humble man who ever lived. You kind of doubt that probably Moses would say it about himself if in fact he was the most humble man. After Solomon's death, and just a couple of dates here to kind of set the basis of the story, ultimately what we're going to do is to look at a passage, Psalm 137, and kind of see how this history, this brief history account can help us to read a passage from biblical text. After Solomon's death, unfortunately, you have a divided kingdom, roughly 922. The north we're going to call Israel, okay, and the south we're going to call Judah, all right? And this is going to be the time of the divided kingdom, as it's sometimes referred to, an internal struggle, a civil strife, a house divided, we might say. And this is often referred to as well as the time of the great prophets, who are often going to ask, where is God? And what does God think about the way in which people are acting, behaving? We're going to have then two exiles. And if you're taking notes, and I kind of hope that you are, this is a really important word for us, exile, to be extracted from one's home country, forced to have to leave it, many times never returning. We'll talk about two of these. The first actually comes from the north here, from Assyria, okay? And this is the first exile, and it happens in roughly 722, okay? And this will be the exile from the northern tribes. So Israel in 722 is taken away, and those northern tribes, those 10 northern tribes are taken away, never to return again. This will be important. The second exile will come in 587, 586. We'll use 586 as our working date. 586, the Babylonian exile. The actual dates, we believe, are roughly 587 to 538. And ironically, the children then of the south, the tribes of the south, especially Jerusalem itself, is attacked and ultimately will return back to Babylon, where they believe then ultimately going to have to stay forever. Once in exile, and here this is such an important moment for us. Many scholars believe that it's roughly around 586, that it's during this time that these stories that are such an integral part of the early formation of the biblical text are going to be composed, collected, redacted, and they will find themselves then serving a really pivotal role as exile unfolds. This is the time when what is often referred to as the Torah, or the often translated as the law, the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, will be compiled. You have all kinds of beautiful poetry as well. We think of Lamentations, this really beautiful and tragic poetry attributed to the prophet Jeremiah, talking about what it's like when Jerusalem does fall. The most important city, sometimes the name is Zion. And this fall of Jerusalem will be critical because it's also the destruction of the temple. While in the wilderness during this wandering, you have this tent structure called the tabernacle, which allows for the presence of God, we are told, to be among the people. Once the city of Jerusalem's temple is built by Solomon, the third of those kings, we now have this place where God dwells in what's called the Holy of Holies. We'll get to all of this in later lectures. But once Jerusalem falls in the city and the temple is destroyed and the people are taken away into exile in 586, one of the central questions is, where is God? And how will we relate with God? The dance that we are describing of a God and God's people becomes problematic. This is one of the reasons why the composition of texts become critical. As, of course, there is no more holy city Zion, there is then the question of where is God and how do we relate to God now that we can no longer worship God in the temple. Psalm 137 that we'll look at here in a few minutes is going to be then such a pivotal psalm, story, poem for us in relationship to this story as we're outlining it now. Just to finish up this history, brief history lesson, 586 is not the end of the story, thankfully. You have the Babylonians being conquered next by the Persians, and Cyrus of Persia in 539 actually is going to allow for the return to Jerusalem, back to Zion. And in 515 you have the new temple built, the walls of Jerusalem are rebuilt. In 445, this is an important moment, what is often referred to as Ezra's reforms, along with Nehemiah. Ezra and Nehemiah both, we'll talk about them as being so important to understanding the formulation of this text that we know of as the Bible. Of course, you know that 336 to 323 is Alexander the Great and the Greek conquest, and so you're going to have, a new kind of conquest that will come in. 63, of course, Pompey and the Roman conquest. I hope that you're seeing kind of a trend here in this story. Always, it seems, it's someone coming in to this land of Israel and trying to subdue these people. Of course, Christ is born in Roman occupation of the area that, of course, we will call today Israel. And then 70 Common Era will be the fall of Jerusalem, and we should point out the writing of the Gospel of Mark, we believe. So our point here is to say, you can follow this movement, this dance in stages. Pre-Abraham to Abraham and the patriarchs, to Moses and the Exodus, to the building of the tabernacle and the wandering, to Joshua and the entry into the promised land and the time of the judges, to the united kingdom under the three kings, the divided kingdoms ending with the two exiles in 722 and 586. Constantly, there is this movement between a people and a people's God. And we want to pay attention to this as we then move into our study of this text, the Bible. Now, we've been talking about now this text in terms of a non-apologetic approach. What I'd like to do just for a few minutes now in the conclusion of this second introductory lecture is to actually demonstrate what we mean when we're talking about the non-apologetic study of a biblical text. So we're going to actually just kind of practice it now to make sure that we have some sense of how that's going to work. Take a pause. I'll set up here, turn off my overhead, and I'll come back to then finish our conversation.